When Haydn came to Eisenstadt and took over the post as Kapellmeister, he found an orchestra that was actually on the small side, made up of 5 violins slash violas, a cello, a violone, which is basically a double bass, we would say, a flute, 2 oboes, 2 horns, and 2 bassoons. So very much the typical makeup, although with a very small string section. And here on this slide, you can see that little by little, he was able to increase the overall numbers of his orchestra drastically over the next about 20 years. Haydn composed for this orchestra, for all their chamber duties, I suppose, a lot of symphonies. Not all of Haydn's symphonies are actually written for Eisenstadt and the Esterhazy family, but most of them are. Haydn composed a total of 104 symphonies, most of which he performed himself with his orchestra, either in Eisenstadt or in Fürth for the Esterhazy family. And that's one of the reasons Haydn is referred to as father of the symphony, which, as we by now know, is not quite true. He didn't really invent the genre, but he is certainly one of the first peaks in the development of the symphony, without which, let's say, a phenomenon like Beethoven would be basically unthinkable. And without Beethoven, a lot of things in the 19th century would be unthinkable. So that's why Haydn becomes this really, really important signpost in music history for the symphony. And the other genre that Haydn stands for as an 18th century composer is the string quartet. We'll see that most composers have one or two important genres that they stand out with or that they stand for. And in Haydn's case, that for sure is the symphony and the string quartet. We'll see in our next class that Mozart, for example, would stand for opera and the piano concerto, 2 genres in which he was extremely not only successful, but also very, very important in the development of these genres. So Haydn composed 104 symphonies and set a pattern that became standard after his death, which is a 4-movement pattern, beginning first movement with a sonata form movement, most of the time or very often introduced by a slow introduction followed by the sonata form. Second movement, any type of slow andante adagio movement in different forms, could be variation, could be ABA form, can be different forms. Third movement, a minuet and trio, and later a scherzo and trio. So piece of music in A-B form that is in triple meter, the minuet probably a little slower than the scherzo, and both of them have an A-B form trio to them, after which the minuet or the scherzo repeats. And then a finale, a fast finale as the fourth movement. They can also be in different forms, could be in sonata form, but can also be in rondo form or other finale forms. So it's really mainly determined that the first movement is in sonata form, and in our examples in this class, we also focus on the first movement form. The other genre that Haydn stands for is, as I said, the string quartet. And I would like you to look at this picture, which shows a typical string quartet formation of the time. And it refers to what I've said before, that the string quartet is really a genre that is not mainly a performance genre, but rather a participation genre. So most string quartets are focused on the 4 people who play it. And when you look at those guys in the picture, they kind of sit in a even less than a semicircle. So it's almost a circle. And that just shows you that it's kind of a closed off group that really plays for themselves, and gets joy out of the intelligent conversation that's happening in this music. And it's really only in the 19th century that we see the first concerts of or public performances of string quartets where there is an audience that's not the quartet itself. That's an important thing to understand this genre. And Haydn is not the first one, again, to compose string quartets, but he is certainly the composer who took the genre to its first absolute success and peak in its development. And it is said that he kind of figured it out by coincidence, because he was invited to a group of people where he played one of the string instruments, and they just asked him to write a 4-part string piece that they could enjoy playing together. And so that's how he ended up writing the first string quartets, and they were so incredibly successful from the very beginning that became one of his shticks, if you will. The example that I want to show you is from a string quartet he composed in the early 1780s. It's like many of them from a collection of 6 that was very common at the time to compose either, not so often 12, but half a dozen, so 6 sonatas, string quartets, trios, and publish them typically as one collection. Sometimes also 3, but 6 was one of the most popular numbers of pieces, if you will. This particular quartet comes from a set of 6 that was published under Opus 33, and has a lot of Haydn's music has kind of surnames or subtitles. These are called the Russian ones because they were actually dedicated to the Grand Duke Paul of Russia. By the way, many of the subtitles or names of symphonies and string quartets are actually not by Haydn, but were given to these pieces later on. In this string quartet, I would like to look at the rondo with you guys, because I think it's a great and very clear example for what I mean with Haydn's wit, and at the same time with one very important compositional concept that we'll hear again and again in the aftermath of Haydn, particularly with Beethoven. And this compositional method or device is called motivic labor. And here's what that means. When you look at the score of this rondo, so it's the last movement of a string quartet, you'll see it's made up actually only of 2 notes. G and E, the piece is in C major, so this is C major, and the piece is basically made up of and that's already part of that wittiness in Haydn's music, that he's able to write an entire rondo basically with 2 notes. So how is this first melody made up? So you hear the first notes, and then those are just repeated, which makes the entire first measure. Then he fills in that space of the third with the pitch in between, which sounds so down and up again. Combined with the first measure is, and then just repeat the original notes again, which gives you the main theme of the rondo. And then to make that into, these are 2 measures now, to make that into a 4-measure phrase, he just repeats the twice, which makes it, and yet more and more time. And here's the theme. And that's basically all he does. And now he's beginning to get more into permutations of his little theme or motive. And this is what is meant by motivic labor. So that music is composed by the means of the smallest motivic cell combined with other small bits and pieces that are then transformed in the course of the entire movement. And you'll see, we'll hear the very, very often in this movement. The other thing is that it's not only those pitches, but he also puts staccato dashes on each of these notes. So you also have that light, funny character, because otherwise it could be... It's not quite as funny as... and then he rounds off the phrase with... And there we go. When you then look at the second part of that A part is in the second violin, and viola picks immediately up on again on that theme. Spun forward. Then you find it in the bass. End of A section. Now remember, the rondo typically has an A, B, A, C, A, D, A maybe form. So now we need a B section. And typically the B section needs to contrast a little bit. So what Haydn does is go to a different key. One of the related keys that's very contrasting. So contrast, of course, this piece was a major, so a contrast would be minor. And what's a minor key that's very related to it? Well, the related minor. So A minor. And this is where he takes us in the B section. And he uses his motive again. But in a different context. So again, that's the idea of wittiness. Use the same motivic idea, but hide it or connect it with a whole new context of the in a context now that's also not short but long. No, remember we had, now it's legato. And then in the second part of that B section, we see that immediately he tries to go back again to the original idea of the... so little by little, the motive leads us back into the A section, into that refrain of the returning A section. And before that A section actually comes, the music comes really down to basically the motivic cells. And shows you that he kind of, what he put together or assembled in the beginning of the movement, he now kind of dissembles. So is already the double one, no? And that's mocked by the higher voices. And then okay, now he cuts that in half and goes. And if you cut that in half, you come to 0. And that's why there is a whole rest. So it goes da 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 da, nothing, and then he goes back to. So that's what I meant with Haydn's wit, and he's really great. And performers and audiences, of course, of the time really understood that too, what he was doing there. I see what you did there, Haydn, and we're just delighted by these amazing ideas that he had there. The C part again takes us to a minor key. In this case, the C minor. I want to draw your attention again to the end of that section, because it ends with. And now he's kind of assembling his motive again, but this time not with the rhythmic devices. Remember, like 4 notes cut in half as 2 notes, cut in half 0 notes. Now he's doing it with intervals or pitch. So he ends up on this G pedal point, and then he goes half step, whole step, third. So again, he's just playing around with this tiny little thing, and yet makes for a really joyful and entertaining piece of music that's not shallow, but actually really witty and entertaining, at the same time playable for the audience, and is, I think, an incredibly impressive example for Haydn's amazing success in the 18th century. So without further ado, now let's have a string quartet actually play it for us. I hope you enjoy. I hope this makes quite clear why Haydn was such an incredibly successful composer of his time. And that success brought him fame throughout Europe, so that, of course, people in other countries were just like, I guess today, we're pop stars. They travel all over the world and play everywhere. So also, people at the time were eager to see it and hear Haydn perform, so that among other countries, it was England that really tried to get a hold of Haydn and make him travel. And Haydn was extremely flattered and got permission from the Esterhazy family to leave his position as Kapellmeister for a while. And when I say a while, it was actually in both cases about a year and a half that he was gone to London, to just go to London, give concerts, compose, and just have enormous success for a while. And so Haydn went to London twice, actually, in 1790 and in 1795. And among other things, he composes his so-called London symphonies there, which is also the last group of 6 symphonies in his entire oeuvre, numbers 93 through 104. So that's his absolute testament of symphonies. He did not compose any symphonies thereafter. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why they are so important in his overall opus as a composer, and my reason for wanting to show you one of them. Remember, when Haydn took his job with the Esterhazy family, the orchestra was rather small. By the 1780s, he had already a flute, 2 oboes, 2 bassoons, 2 horn strings, and sometimes trumpets and timpani. Now, traditionally, ever since the Renaissance, trumpets and timpani are not members of the chapel, but because they're very important as signal players for the military, they're typically also associated with the military and not with the court chapel. Which also kind of gives them a higher rank in standing at court, so they were kind of important people. And trumpets and timpani in the later 18th century, so the time that we're talking about here, I want to say 99% of all cases come together as this trio. So the timpani serves, if you will, as the bass instrument to the 2 trumpets. And so Haydn has trumpets at his disposal, and now in London, he's welcomed with the most amazing forces that you can imagine to perform music, and that also, of course, includes clarinets. Clarinets are, as you probably know, rather young instruments as compared to all the other wind instruments. They were invented in the early 1700s and became part of the orchestra really in the 1770s, 80s, little by little. At first, actually played by the oboe players, and the fingering was the same, so it was just basically like in a, I guess, pit orchestra on Broadway, where those guys also play like 3-4 instruments. That was also the case in the 18th century. But then eventually they were used as their own pair, so that little by little we arrive at the standard orchestra, classical orchestra composition of 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns or 4 horns, trumpets and timpani, and the string section. The example for the symphony that I would like to show you is from Haydn's second to last symphony. It's from number 103, which he premiered in London in 1795. And we're looking at the first movement because it's in classical sonata form with a slow introduction. As I said earlier, that's a very typical device that the sonata form movement of a symphony has kind of a slow introduction preceding it. This symphony is scored for this large type orchestra, so 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, 2 trumpets, timpani, and strings. The orchestra of the first performance was unusually large, consisting of 60 players, and the direction of the orchestra was kind of split, and that was very typical for Haydn's orchestras, that he did part of the direction or conducting, if you will, from either the violin or the keyboard instrument. And the concertmaster from the violin did also some of the leading. So it was kind of an interplay between the keyboard player and the concertmaster to lead the orchestra, as there was no conductor for symphonies at this point in music history. The premiere of the symphony in London must have been an amazing success. I want to read a little snippet to you from the review that appeared in the newspaper The Morning Chronicle, where the reviewer writes, and I quote, "Another overture," and he means a symphony here, "by the fertile and enchanting Haydn was performed, which, as usual, had continual strokes of genius, both in air and harmony. The introduction excited deepest attention. The allegro charmed, the andante was encored, the minuets, especially the trio, were beautiful and sweet, and the last movement was equal, if not superior, to the preceding." Ever since its premiere, this piece has been regularly performed. It's one of the pieces in the standard repertoire. And in 1831, even Richard Wagner transcribed it for piano because he felt it was such an important masterpiece. By the way, the symphony also has a subtitle or a name. It's called The Drum Roll. For no other reason than it actually begins with a drum roll, which, as you can imagine, is yet another stroke of wit and genius by Haydn to just not disappoint expectations of disappointing expectations. Does that make any sense? So he just plays with the expectation of the audience, I guess, expecting a big chord at the beginning of the symphony. And he does the exact opposite. He has the timpani play a role, and timpanis of the time, and I guess really timpanis today too, you don't have a strong sense of pitch when you just hear a pianissimo roll. So it's more like a noise, and that's just super funny. And Haydn was really, really good at finding new ideas how to just be funny. Then, well, let's look at the score a little more closely. So after the drum roll, he doesn't even give us a key yet. Rather, he has everybody, well, in fact, it's not everybody. It's only the bassoons, the double basses, and the cello. So really in the lowest register of the orchestra, has them play piano and in octaves, a melody that couldn't obscure the tonality any more than it does. Just listen to this. Do you know what key we're in? I'm pretty sure the listeners of the first performance had exactly no idea what key we're in, because Haydn did such a great job to obscure it as much as possible. So that was the bassoons, the cello double basses, and in the end, the winds came in with what sounded like a 5-1, but it's a 5-1 of 5. So it's actually a B flat major cadence, so has already totally misled us where we are. Then he just goes on in the same manner. Which is actually a 5-1 in the tonic that we're in, E flat major, but he has confused us so much now that we continue to not really know what's going on here. Then he changes register completely and goes from the basses to the violins. So again, we don't know. He's almost like making fun of us, and just like that. No, I'm not telling you where we're going. And so this goes on for a while, and I think we should listen to it with the orchestra just to see how much he's basically leading us on. Also, towards the end of that introduction, making us almost believe that actually the symphony is really in C minor, not in E flat major. Because listen to those last measures. So he gets to. So you almost expect something like as the first theme, but it's actually not. It's really. So he's led us on completely, made us believe it's in C minor, and it's really in E flat major. Now the main theme is built very similarly. I think you'll find a certain resemblance to it with the rondo that we've already talked about, in that it's. So again, 2 short notes, then 2 long ones, and then the 16th. And that, you'll see, will become very important because he's really good at cutting off, almost like with a pair of scissors in motivic labor, component parts of the theme to use in the development of the music. So at first, I wrote all this in the score so you can follow along as we listen to it. We hear the first theme, and as I said before, Haydn's symphonic movements for the bigger part are monothematic. That means the sonata form movement has only one main theme, not two. But this is actually one of the very few examples that is bi-thematic, so that has 2 main themes, because I wanted to show you a movement that more closely resembles the idea of sonata form that you probably have. So after a while, we modulate to B flat major, the dominant of the main key, where the second theme in the dominant occurs. And then you'll see Haydn play around with the whole idea in the development. I think it'll be very clear when you listen to it. So let's listen for a bit.
Thank you.
Did you see what he's doing here? Did you see where that material came from that he introduced now in the development that really is neither the first theme nor the second theme? That's actually material from the introduction. Just because it's played real fast now, it's hard to re-identify, but it is, and that's yet another genius stroke of Haydn to use. That's not normally or that's not typical for a development to pick up on material from the introduction. The introduction is typically just left behind, but Haydn in a really clever way reintroduces that material here. Let's listen on. So here's a good moment where Haydn does his pair of scissors thing again, where he just cuts off little bits and pieces of the theme, in this case, the head, the da-da, and just runs with that. So you hear da-da, 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 and then now comes a section in which he takes the theme almost like for a walk through very, very remote keys. So let's look at that. What's going on here? Wasn't it that we almost felt like, I mean, we had the recap, we had the first theme, we had the second theme. Shouldn't the movement now be kind of over? And yet Haydn stops. Yet another surprise moment. One of those surprise moments that just Haydn loves so much. He has this idea now to reintroduce a few of the measures from the introduction, which is really uncommon and not expectable at all, but that's exactly why Haydn does it. So let's enjoy that and the end of the movement. I think this has made very clear why Haydn was so popular and successful, because he has this incredibly witty and original and highly individual compositional style that just pleased patrons, players, and audiences alike. He knows the conventions, certainly. He's strongly influenced by the Galant style of C.P. Bach, and yet he gives it his own spin, among other things, with that element of the complete unexpected and surprise element. He clearly is educated in the Baroque style. You saw that in the fugal, very contrapuntal moment of the development, where you can tell, yeah, I mean, this guy as a boy soprano has sung a lot of Baroque music in church, and he certainly did, and he has acquired the techniques of that style, of the polyphonic style, to use that as well and make for this typical double appeal of both the sophisticated but also the clear and natural of the Enlightenment. He is one of those composers who is really good at composing melodies that you remember, composing melodies that you whistle as you walk out of the concert, and is fantastic at using very economical material, just like, or, and turn it into something extremely memorable, funny, and just music that people loved. And one of his main, that's an important takeaway, one of his main compositional strategies being the motivic labor. Haydn then returns to Vienna and eventually retires from his position with the Esterházys. The Esterházys grant him a lifelong pension, and actually even increased it further down the line when Haydn became quite sick. But for the last 13 years of his life, after he returned to Vienna in 1795, Haydn really lived the life of an absolute celebrity. So much so that one of his biographers reports that the Esterházys even visited him in his house in Vienna, which, you know, from an 18th century perspective is just almost unbelievable. No noble person would, you know, go visit their servants in their house. It's just impossible. But that just shows you that in many ways Haydn had become noble himself by his genius as a composer, and so he leads an absolutely fantastic life in his last years in Vienna. This is also the time when he composes two large-scale oratorios. First, The Creation in 1798, and then The Four Seasons in 1801. That earns him prizes and medals from all over Europe, and is just the cherry on top of the cake of his success as a composer. Eventually, in 1803, his health little by little begins to decline. I guess you could say he also had onset of dementia. His earliest biographer, who interviewed him in these last 4 years of his life between 1804 and 1808, reports that he could increasingly not remember things, mainly remembering, which is typical for dementia, remembering things of the very, very distant past, and not even remember that you met someone yesterday, but remembering his own childhood much more. So his health was also not the best. Of course, you can imagine early 19th century medical treatments weren't particularly helpful, but Haydn got to be quite old, actually. And and was cared for very well, not least thanks to the Esterhazy family, so that he died in 1809, aged 77. However, not under very happy circumstances, and that's something that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks from now when we look at Beethoven's biography, because this is yet another intersection of history that we're looking now at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and the Napoleonic troops had made it to Vienna, so that Beethoven basically died under during bomb attacks of Vienna during the French armies. However, even the French generals still came to him and paid him his respects. That was one of his probably very last musical experiences on his deathbed, that this French officer sang an aria from one of his oratorios for him. A few days later, Haydn died peacefully in, as I said, on May 31 of 1809. His works include, as I said, 104 symphonies, 20 concertos, 68 string quartets, 29 piano trios, 126 baritone trios, 47 keyboard sonatas, 15 operas, 12 masses, several oratorios, numerous chamber works. So an incredibly fulfilled life as a composer and artist. And lastly, his works are typically, his catalog of works are typically given as HOB, for Hoboken. Anthony van Hoboken was a music theorist who cataloged Haydn's works. And this catalog is what we call a systematic catalog. So it catalogs all his works by genre. And so, for example, often you see HOBs, so Hoboken, Roman numeral 1, and then colon, and then a number. So, for example, the symphony that we looked at is Hoboken Roman numeral 1, because that stands for the symphonies, colon 103. 103 is the 103rd symphony. That's contrary to, for example, Mozart's or Schubert's catalogs of works, the Köchel and the Deutsch catalogs, because those are actually chronological catalogs. So let's say Köchel catalog number 1 was Mozart's earliest piece, and Köchel's 626 is the Requiem and his last piece. So that's really chronologically, while the Hoboken catalog is a so-called systematic catalog of works ordered by genres. That's all for today. We could really talk an entire semester about Haydn and his fantastic compositional output. I hope this gave you a little bit of an idea about his importance in music history, and I hope you had fun listening to the two examples that we looked at today. Our next composer is Mozart, who had also close contact to Haydn and was strongly influenced by him, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. In the meantime, if you have any questions, ask them down below in the comments or in the Q&A, and I see you very soon. Take care. Bye.